Activists on the human catastrophe in Darfur have a lot of questions. Is this a genocide? How should the catastrophe be ended? What's the connection between Darfur and the civil war in southern Sudan? Because of difficulties in answering these questions, many activists have a hard time making a convincing intellectual case for action in Darfur. They especially recognize the sharp contrast between their activism for Darfur and the earlier activism of students, community members in the 1980s against the apartheid regime of South Africa. In that case, there was a clear goal: ending apartheid, implementing full civil liberties for the black population of South Africa. Practically any tactic in that activism was acceptable: sanctions, divestment, civil disobedience, even violent resistance, which the African National Congress adopted, supporting that violent resistance to the apartheid regime. The leaders of the African National Congress were men and women of integrity, and their goals were clear. In the Darfur case, it's much harder to know and trust the leaders in Sudan and in Darfur. It's hard to know what they want. Indeed, it isn't always clear that the rebel leaders in Darfur know what they want themselves. I believe that the right thing to do is to make sure that an activist knows the basic, correct narrative of what has happened and what is happening in Darfur in the context of broader events in Sudan. Once the narrative is mastered, then a few goals become clear. And once the goals are clear, then activists can have proper debates about what tactics will best lead to those goals. So the agenda for an activist is narrative, goals, and tactics. February 2003 is when the low-level violence that had characterized Darfur for decades exploded onto the world stage. Darfur is an ethnic mosaic with many different ethnic groups. The larger of these groups are the Fur, the Masalit, the Zaghawa, the Bagara, the Rizegat, the Zayadia, and there are others. These groups are all subdivided. The Rizegat, for example, they include a cattle herding section in the south and a camel herding section called the Abala in the north. The Abala section of the Rizegat are themselves divided into two clans, the Mohammed and the Mahariya. One sub-clan in the Mohammed, in turn, is called the Jalul, and their sheikh, a man named Musa Hilal, is widely regarded as a key figure in organizing the violence that began in earnest in 2003. Clearly a leading figure in the Janjaweed forces in Darfur, but other members of his tribe, writ large, the Rizegat, are not participating at all in the violence, and indeed maintain a steadfast neutrality in the violence that has engulfed Darfur. So that's why the mosaic image of ethnicity, as opposed to two separate ethnicities on warring sides, is a more appropriate view of ethnicity in Darfur. There is intermarriage between the various ethnic groups in Darfur. People in Darfur can and do claim multiple identities. Some of the groups, of those groups that I mentioned, they are and call themselves Arabs. They trace their lineages back to Arab groups from the Arabian Peninsula. Other groups who are called locally Zunji or Zurga, especially by the Arab groups, not so much by themselves, so it's more of a third-person denoter of ethnic identity to say that someone else is a Zunji. One doesn't say typically that oneself is a Zunji or a Zurga, but those groups trace themselves back to indigenous groups. But every person in Darfur who's honest with themselves will admit that every person in Darfur can trace their lineage through both groups. There's nobody in Darfur who will say that someone is 100% Arab lineage, 100% local indigenous lineage. All of the lineages can trace themselves back to one or the other groups. Now, politicians and traditional leaders, sheikhs, for example, in Darfur, as in elsewhere in Africa, they often have an interest in mobilizing people on ethnic lines. They tell their followers that the other group is getting more resources than they are. And over the years, ethnic groups in Darfur have waxed and waned in terms of how well their leaders are able to mobilize them into violence. As I said, Darfur has seen local level violence going on for decades now. Many young men in Darfur went to fight on the government side in the long civil war in southern Sudan. Other young men in Darfur have gone to Libya and been trained by the Libyans as part of a kind of foreign legion that the Libyans had, especially in the 1980s when they had President Muammar Gaddafi of Libya had sort of illusions of forging a grander Arab entity in the Sahara. So Darfur has been militarized for several decades now. That's been a fact of life in Darfur. So every year until 2003 brought dozens of clashes, but also attempts by leaders to work out resolutions of those clashes through traditional peacemaking arrangements by having councils where warring parties would come together and talk, where compensation might be paid to those who had lost the families of those who had lost lives. The military government of northern Sudan, which took power in a military coup in 1989, in the 1980s increasingly turned to a small number of ethnic groups in Darfur, those that identified themselves most keenly as Arabs, that emphasized, that played up their Arab lineages. Some of these groups had been influenced by the training that some of their younger members received in Gaddafi's Libya as this attempt to forge this sort of more expansionist Arab-oriented entity in the Sahara. And those groups, in alliance with the government, started working to suppress the traditional peacemaking arrangements that different tribal leaders had. They worked to oppress some of the groups that identified themselves as more indigenous groups, particularly the Four, the sort of dominant indigenous identity group in the region for which it's named, Darfur, the land of the Four. So those groups started being harassed by these traditional, groups that identified themselves as Arab groups, and the government. Leaders of these groups, as well as political leaders from the central government who fell out of favor with the central government in the late 1990s. There was a split in the military regime. Hassan al-Turabi, the leader of the Islamist movement in Sudan, who had taken power with General Omar Bashir, the president, in 1989, he was imprisoned in 1999. So his followers allied also with some of these disaffected groups, these oppressed groups in Darfur. And so in 2003, these various factions formed two rebel groups, one known as the Justice and Equality Movement, the other the Sudan Liberation Army. And these two rebel groups started fighting in earnest, quite seriously, in 2003. In retaliation, the government of Sudan, based in Khartoum, the military regime, allied itself with these Arab groups, gave them weapons, gave them training, and in coordination and many times under the direction of the Sudanese armed forces, they launched an all-out war against civilian populations, identified as potentially sympathetic to the rebel movement. And the result is, as every Darfur activist knows, has been large-scale displacement of civilian populations, direct attacks on civilian populations, up to 3 million displaced, and certainly hundreds of thousands of people have been killed directly and indirectly as a result of the displacement in the violence. The government of Sudan has done very little to resolve the insecurity in Darfur, and peace talks are dragging on in Abuja, Nigeria, where they have not yet met with any success. So the current round, it's middle of March as I speak, and the current round of peace talks is still underway. It's very important to understand that the targeting of civilians by proxy militias was a favorite tactic of the government of Northern Sudan in prosecuting its war against the South, against the rebels of the Sudan People's Liberation Army. And only 8 years ago, in 1998, those tactics of using proxy militias that targeted civilians led to a horrific famine in Bahr el-Ghazal, the province just south of Darfur. In that famine that resulted from the suspension of humanitarian assistance and deliberate attacks on civilians by the government side, certainly hundreds of thousands of people died. So the government of Northern Sudan, for them, there's nothing really new in what's going on in Darfur. Now, the Southern rebels, the Sudan People's Liberation Army, they signed a peace agreement with the government of Sudan in January 9th, 2005. The Comprehensive Peace Agreement, or CPA as it's called, calls for power sharing between the SPLA and the military regime in the north, represented by something called the National Congress Party. The National Congress Party gets 52% of the power in Sudan. The SPLA gets 28% of power in the central government, called the Government of National Unity. And the SPLA also gets to run a government of South Sudan, which will have virtually complete autonomy over internal affairs in southern Sudan. Moreover, the SPLA, the government of South Sudan, in 6 years will have the option of voting in a referendum for independence for South Sudan. The CPA also calls for sharing of the oil wealth, mostly located in the south of Sudan. The south of Sudan will get, the government of South Sudan will get 50% of the oil wealth, currently running at approximately $4 billion a year, will be split between the north and the south. If oil prices go higher, there will be even more revenues. No one doubts that in 2011, when the referendum happens in the south of Sudan, the people of South Sudan will vote for independence. They suffered for too long as part of a province of northern Sudan, a backwater district of northern Sudan. So that endgame of what happens in 2011 is very important for understanding why the conflict in Darfur is so difficult to resolve. Because the Comprehensive Peace Agreement did not specify who would own that oil in south of Sudan after 2011. Did not specify what the agreement would be between the south of Sudan and the north of Sudan over the oil revenues that would accrue after 2011. So there's little doubt in my mind that the military regime in northern Sudan, which to all effects and purposes controls the government of national unity, and we've seen the SPLA join this government of national unity, but been so far unable to change the culture of impunity that characterizes northern Sudan. There's little reason to think that that security cabal that controls the government of national unity in northern Sudan will let elections, the referendum, go unimpeded in 2011. So the countdown to 2011, the insecurity that's going to happen as that countdown gets closer, the uncertainty over what's going to happen to the division of the oil wealth, that's, I think, an important reason why the insecurity, the political insecurity in Darfur can't resolve. Because the rebel groups in Darfur, divided themselves, also face a government of national unity that doesn't really know what it's going to look like 5 years from now. Will there be two separate entities in Sudan? Who will have control over the oil revenues? What kind of split between those oil revenues and the marginal region of Darfur can be agreed to when the two parties on the government side, the SPLA and the National Congress Party, don't know how they're going to split the oil revenues themselves in 2011. So that's very briefly why we have a stalemate right now, why the political resolution of the crisis is so difficult right now, why the two parties can't just get together and agree and say, we have $300 or $400 million that we can split up to work out a peace arrangement in Darfur. And why political leaders in all factions are comfortable with the status quo of displacement and international humanitarian assistance because they can't really predict or manage the dynamics of a peace settlement that they may end up agreeing to. Thank you very much.